Welcome to our penultimate session in our Advancing Inclusive Leadership Forum. Recalling a world at war, the UN Secretary General recently told the heads of state, this is our 1945 moment. But I like to think of this moment as our Nuremberg moment, a time for reckoning and a time for justice, when we correct great wrongs. So to summon the spirit of Justice Jackson, I would like to ask the question, how do we correct the wrongs that we seek to condemn? Because unless those wrongs are not corrected, we risk those wrongs being repeated. So what are those wrongs? Because some of those wrongs are so pervasive that they are invisible in their insidious nature. A young woman entrepreneur recently told me, when a man walks into the room, it's automatically assumed that he's competent. When I walk in the room, it's automatically assumed I'm not. According to a recent Harvard Business Review study, while on average, venture capitalists invest more than 58 billion in startups, women only get 2% of the money. When men pitch startups, they get asked how they'll make money. But women get asked about how they'll prevent losing investors' money. And those questions can have a direct impact on how much funding they receive. So with that, I'm going to start by invoking the poet, the favorite poet of Microsoft's CEO, Satya Nadella. And Satya Nadella often refers to the poet Vijay Seshadri and his poem Square Root of -1. And he often says in charge to developers to use that poetry to democratize access to technology, access to funds. And he says, we all seek to unlock the unimaginable and solve the impossible. That's the quest we are on. The soul, like the square root of -1, is an impossibility that has its users. So I think of how do we, in this moment in history, how do we do the unimaginable and solve the impossible? And all of you are here because you're on that quest to solve the impossible. So as we all know, a crisis is looming in corporate America. 1 in 4 women are considering downshift in their careers or leaving the workforce due to COVID-19. This is the final analysis of McKinsey Global's and Lean In's report. So my questions to all 3 of you, and I want you when answering them, starting with Steve Crown, is to look at this in a cohesive whole. How can women and women of color break into the big boys club? How can we adopt a version of the NFL's Rooney Rule, where the final pool of candidates for a position reflects the diversity that's in society? How do we ensure that there are mentors, supporters, and sponsors for all, including women and women of color? And how do we take the leap of faith that Sonia Sam was talking when it comes to getting around your head to hiring someone who does not look like you? Can we take that leap of faith? And then, and this goes to Satya Nadella, once again, Microsoft CEO's goal and his mission, because I think there is no more ambitious and more powerful mission than the mission that Microsoft embodies, which is to empower every person on the planet. And that is the mission and the vision, but Microsoft then goes on to make that mission real in very tangible ways. And I know Steve will talk about the recent pledges to increase by $150 million, the diversity and inclusion efforts at Microsoft to recruit from historically Black colleges and to continue to resist any challenges by the Department of Labor that they've recently faced with. But against that, against Microsoft's own pledges, is this rhetoric we've been talking about in the last couple of days, where there are diversity and inclusive efforts that are more rhetoric than real. And they are so vague and overbroad that they really do not have the impact that we are looking at. So how can this time of a call to action result in real impact? And when we look back on this Nuremberg moment, we can say that we raised the standard of leadership to meet the challenges of our time. So Steve?
Well, thank you. And it's great to be with all the panelists. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop at the top of the hour, but I'll stay on as long as I can. And always the experience I have in these discussions is there's too little time and too much to say. So let me start with a couple of things. One is about our mission. I really do like your focus on Satya. It was Satya who really pushed for the words I love most in our mission. And those are the words "on the planet," which might not seem very important, but actually when you dig into the mission, it is empowering every person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. It's not because we thought people would think we were talking about Mars or Jupiter. It was because if you're really going to focus on helping every person, you have to think about literally every person. And that includes people in the most disadvantaged situations, those who face the most discrimination and impediments throughout their lives and generations. It also means engaging in countries like Russia or China. Our responsibility is actually to be a voice for improving the human condition. And we are about it. It's a statement of our values as a company, our strategy. It's our culture. We are about empowering people. And that necessarily means it's the human experience, it's dignity and human rights. How do we get after that? And I don't want to spend too much time talking about all the things we're doing. I actually believe the question people should ask is, it's a really nice talk you have. How do you walk the walk? And how do I trust you? Why don't you prove it if this is what you're saying? So one thing I'd like to do, being somebody in the legal department, is point out how we've been at this for more than a decade. Of course, we've been at it for as long as the company existed. But actually back in 2008, we as the legal department put in place a law firm diversity program. In that, those of us who were on the leadership team, we actually put part of our own compensation was invested in, do we drive this change or not? Do we actually track and report improvements? So let me just kind of say, this was initially about especially African-American lawyers, looking at what was happening in law firms, both the pipeline issues, so that goes to education, but especially the retention and the advancement and the leadership voices that we thought were missing from the representation we were getting. So we had a very clear focus on, we wanted to increase in a broad way all of the roles that outside counsel were playing for Microsoft in making sure that teams were staffed with people who represented the diversity that we think our business requires. We think every business requires. And so we do things like track with our major law firms how many minorities, and we've expanded it over the years to include a great number of underrepresented parts of the legal profession. But how many people are in leadership positions? We have people report on partnership. We have people look at what is the diverse lawyering makeup on all of the Microsoft projects, each project as well as all of the Microsoft projects in a law firm. We've every year modified the program slightly. In 2015, we had a renewed focus on leadership and partnership and leadership experiencing, mentoring, and those sorts of issues that in our view and what we were learning, those were missing in many law firms. So we then looked in 2019, we changed it to be much more about reporting to us and being rewarded for innovation in driving improvements in the statistics that were being reported. I think I might stop there because I do want to hear what others have to say, not just speak and then run away. But let me just say that we do, my role is specifically on human rights. We use that mission every day in the work we do. It's how I explain why we're working in China, why we're working in Russia. And our belief is In all of these matters, and whether it's the challenges we have in the United States or in places that don't respect rule of law, even at the level we do, we actually believe the best way of driving change is to be engaged, not to say, this is so difficult or this is so ugly, we're not going to soil our hands. It's rather coming in with a principled, values-driven approach, supported at the very top of an organization, whether it's a law firm or a company, to say we need to improve this. And that literally goes back to our mission. This is what we're about, is empowering people to achieve more. And that means every person on the planet. But I'll stop there and I'll be happy to take questions if there is time.
Thank you. So we just heard from Steve Crown, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, Human Rights from Microsoft. And to your point, Steve, about how do we take the rhetoric and make it real, is very well taken. And that takes me to Wilma Wallace, who is the General Counsel for REI. And Wilma, you have often said change has been way too slow. And oftentimes we are stepping back. And this moment in time of COVID and a mass public reckoning does give us pause, because there is this threat of the progress that we have made being reversed or rolled back. So given the fact that, Wilma, you are not only a general counsel, but a thought leader for diversity and inclusion, and you've always worked in corporations such as GAP and REI, which embody those values. Now, GAP and REI have been at the forefront of diversity and inclusion. How can we ensure that we are not backsliding, that we are not reversing the progress that we have made, and that when change is too slow, how can we accelerate that change for equality? Wilma?
So thank you, Ranjita. And I do want to just applaud Steve and the work that Microsoft has done really over the past 20 years. I led the legal department diversity and inclusion program at Gap 15 years ago, and was inspired, by the work that Microsoft was leading, and put their money where their mouth was. So thanks for being a leader on diversity and inclusion. So as Steve said,
this is point, Wilma, I love the fact that you're speaking to each other, because very often, and over the last 3 days, we've had lawyers and business leaders join in this conversation who have invoked Microsoft as the driving force for their own diversity and inclusion programs, that Microsoft has incentivized it and has demanded it. And that kind of demand-driven nature of the dynamic has helped law firms and other corporations to diversify their legal team. So thank you, Wilma, for bringing that up.
Yes. No, this is a team sport, and it's difficult. And for those of us who've been involved in diversity and inclusion for now 30 years myself, coming from law school and starting to practice in San Francisco, because it was a progressive legal community that had goals and timetables which were aggressive, but we failed to meet over the past 30 years around increasing diversity in the legal profession. Seattle presents, and the Pacific Northwest presents, a whole nother environment and challenge around recruiting and attracting a diverse workforce. So the challenges are huge and significant. And a year ago, Ranjita, you reminded me that I was very impatient and called for the need for a cultural shift. Well, I think Black Lives Matters and 2020 has been a cataclysmic shift, in the culture. And more so than any time, again, in the 30 years that I've been practicing law, do I see organizations making what I believe is the level of commitment that needs to be made in order for change to happen. And I've thought a lot over the past 6 to 7 months around commitment and what that really means. And recognizing that it starts with an understanding of where you're coming from and having a real conversation around your identity and your relationship with diversity, your identity and your relationship with a group identity, your identity and your relationship with privilege, and having a real conversation about how you're contributing to a system and even recognizing a system. I think that's been a real awakening for leaders in corporate America, and particularly white men, who are, as I'll say, and I'm sure I'm using this word incorrectly, but are becoming woke to the privilege and the systems in place that allow for their advancement and disenfranchisement by others, particularly people of color. So I'm more optimistic than ever about how leaders are leading through this change in order to fulfill their mission and fulfill their purpose with vulnerability, with humility, and with a growth mindset, to then be able to impact and affect change within their organizations, their communities, and you know, in a greater kind of global sense. So I'll stop there, and I too have a hard stop at the top of the hour, unfortunately.
Absolutely. So you spoke about the importance of cultural change, but you've also been someone who's spoken about, and I quote you, about the way in which implicit bias is so heavily ingrained in people's psyches that the first step needs to be able to first recognize those biases and then address them. So with that, Patricia Daley, you lead the diversity and inclusion practice as partner at Deloitte. I want to ask you, how do you recognize implicit biases as the first step, because they're so invisible and pervasive, and then how do you attack the heavily ingrained nature of those biases?
Well, thank you very much, Ranjita, and great to hear everybody. I wish we could all probably dialogue a little bit more, but implicit bias, I mean, that is something that is hot topic. How we're dealing with it, and I did just want to clarify one thing. At a global level, diversity, equity, and inclusion are embedded in Deloitte's purpose and our shared values. And so it is permeated through everything we do. It is something that we believe we lead in, but we know we are so not there. And I, you know, deal with implicit bias on an everyday basis. And I think as Wilma was saying, I think, you know, the recent events, and so I sit in Canada, I'm our Chief Inclusion Officer in Canada, but it's the same thing here as it is, you know, in the United States, as we see in many other countries. It just looks slightly different. It has caused us to have really honest and frank conversations around power, privilege, white society, and, you know, the systems that have been built around, you know, the support and advancement of white built systems, and particularly those that are also male dominated. And it's been a really frank conversation that I've never ever experienced. And just to give you an example, I'm running a board session in a few weeks, very explicitly, to have this power privilege conversation, you know, introducing topics around, you know, how our systems are built for white, you know, supremacy. And those are difficult. So I think it's about, one, raising to consciousness that we all, as humans, we have bias. I mean, we are bombarded with so many pieces of information. Our brain has created shortcuts on how we process that. It's necessary for us to function in daily life. However, when we use those as it relates to making decisions about people, we can also make a lot of mistakes in doing that. And I think it is so important to raise to consciousness and to be slow down and, you know, recognize when our biases are coming to the fore when we're making decisions. People is the obvious place when it comes to any of the talent life cycles. You know, we're in a client service business, and so it's also very important, you know, part of our mission is, our purpose is to make an impact that matters. And so we look at that not just with respect to our people, but also with respect to our clients, our people and our communities at large. And so how are we showing up in the community? How are we helping to advance a more inclusive country? How are we helping other organizations further a much greater level of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So it's a lens that we put on a 360 basis. I could give you a couple of examples.
Yeah. So since Steve and Wilma have to leave, I have one last question for both of them. We had Steve, Craig Newmark, joining us yesterday, and Craig is the founder, the legendary founder of Craig's List. And he made a comment very similar to Patricia's comment about the importance of recognizing power. And that's the first step. And then recognizing the fact that allyship, which is now what we are seeking, but that allyship can itself be a theater. So he says, addressing both power on one hand and the theater of allyship, you know, the performative allyship that really does more harm than good, Wilma, as you always know. So we need allies who can address power, but it has to be real allyship. So Steve, as a white male, how do you see yourself as a real ally, distinct and kind of differentiating that from the theater of allyship?
Yeah, so very briefly, I'll put it in the Microsoft context in that, you know, we're a data-driven place. We're a bunch of engineers at heart. And one of the ways that we found we can communicate on this is actually ask people to stop and think, which sounds obvious, but if you create an opinion very quickly, what's the data behind that? Just stopping and thinking. I think the greatest accomplishment in the last, let's say 18, 24 months, but of course it was accelerated this spring and summer, was we actually have a new vocabulary that people are able to use. We have all employees at Microsoft taking training on these notions of not just the institutional biases, but the unconscious bias. When you have met somebody for 3 minutes and you have an impression of that person, what's driving that impression? What are you really doing? So think about that and think about what can you do to combat the bias that might be at play. Push yourself on that. But I also think we've really done a lot of work at thinking about understanding covering and passing. The idea of you are not bringing your real self to work. So how might that be affecting your colleagues or your team if you're a manager? Making sure that we're actually trying to make people comfortable talking about their authentic experience. And I think all of that ties into allyship, of making sure that it's not just as a white male, for example, saying, I am here to help you. It's really, I'm here to understand what I might do to help you, to actually have the conversation about what would be helpful, to talk about things that seem to matter in the culture that from my perspective might be new or a different lens on it, but not to think that we make people into our own images. That notion of allyship is aligning and trying to be helpful as opposed to trying to craft people into the mold.
I love that. And what you're doing is also providing a new vernacular, new vocabulary to address those biases. So Wilma, I want you to respond to Steve. As a Black woman leader, I want you to share with Steve what you expect from a peer such as Steve.
Mm-hmm. So I will say I'll take allyship in any form it comes, you know, because people are on a journey. And we have to get comfortable with saying the wrong things, making assumptions that aren't grounded, you know, in reality. And this is my own point of view, right? But I will take that. And as long as it's offered with good intentions. Steve, you know, referenced the concept of humbleness. Is what I heard, you know, you kind of referred to, Steve, and coming with a sense of learning versus performance versus, I'm not sure what word to use, but I think just to remain open and humble and ask, how can you help? How can I advance you? How can I help you find your voice, in this forum? And using your privilege, our privilege, I mean, all of us on this phone are very privileged in many, many ways, but using your privilege in a way that's not presumptive or assuming, but probing and questioning and offered in a very humble way.
So, Wilma, that was excellent. But I also want to build on what Steve said about the importance of language, because language has no innocence and vocabulary is important. On our first session, I had Dr. Sanjay Sama, who is a renowned scientist and engineer at MIT, the vice president of MIT, speaking to us about the importance of language, and that he said he had used the word voodoo science in talking to a Haitian scientist who then turned to him and said, "That's my religion you're talking about." So I think there is no innocence in language. Language has the power to build those barriers and those biases and those boundaries. So my last question for this session is to Patricia. Patricia, in your own work as a D&I expert, how do you address through frameworks and new vernaculars the importance of those subtle, insidious, invisible biases that perpetuate systemic racism and systemic sexism?
First off is awareness, making sure that people are aware of all the different ways that systemic bias and language, is used that create, that injure people, that create oppression, that create advantage or disadvantage. So I think awareness, calling it out, really, ideally in a professional and helpful way. We have an internal social media that we use. It's called Yammer. Many people have it. And we actually have got a discourse going right now, very specifically on language. And so it's a very fluid, social, organic, and our CEO is actively engaged in it, and I'm actively engaged in it. When our CEO gets engaged, we have tens of thousands of people who engage in the conversation. So that is really helping to build knowledge, build capability. We do training because I think it's important, but I think it's fundamentally insufficient to actually address it. We hold our leaders accountable for feedback around how they are acting as leaders, and we hold them accountable, bye Steve, for being an inclusive leader. And that there's 6 points to how we hold them accountable there.
So the accountability is important. So these are all hard questions, and you've come up with really granular and concrete suggestions. So thank you very much to our leaders, Steve Crown, who joined us from Microsoft, who is Microsoft's General Counsel for Human Rights and Vice President at Microsoft. Wilma, you are you're somebody who's pioneered the field of D&I at GAP, at REI, and you live those values. You're the General Counsel of REI, but you continue to lead so many different organizations, including Landesa and different human rights organizations. And Patricia, for the work you're doing at Deloitte, because Deloitte is one of the at the forefront of D&I. You get to shape the discourse and the language that will help us to take us forward and build a new history. So thank you very much to all of you. And now to our final session, final part of this Advancing Inclusive Leadership. Thank you, Wilma.
Thank you.